Sanchez-Jankowski, and I'm director of ISSI, but also chair of the Center for Ethnographic Research, which is the sponsor of this event today. And I want to make an announcement about an upcoming event that the Center for Ethnographic Research will have, and as well as to remind all of you in the audience to check your phones and see that they're in the silent mode before we begin. I do want to draw your attention, as I've indicated, to our next event, and our next event involves another person who was associated with sociology here, who went on to do ethnographic research. An interesting study is Sid Martinez, who is presently assistant professor of sociology at the University of San Diego, and he's going to give a talk based on his recently published book, The Neighborhood Has Its Own Rules, Latinos and African Americans in South Central Los Angeles. And that talk will be on Thursday, as opposed to Wednesdays, which we usually do. Thursday, September 29th, from 4 to 5:30 here in the Voldovsky Room. And I'd like to also today acknowledge that the co-sponsor of this event is the Center for Labor Research and Education. And books, I think we'll have some books here that will be out there that you can purchase, and I assume Steve will be happy enough to sign them for you. Now let me introduce our speaker today, and he will speak for roughly 45 minutes, and then we'll turn it over to all of you for questions. And I'm going to sit right where that red little insignia is right there. And then after it's all done, I'll come back up and I will be the person who sees your hands going up and puts you in the queue to ask a question. And then Steve is entitled to answer the way he wants. But it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, who I've known for many, many years, as well as his wife, who was also a graduate of our department. He received his Ph.D. in sociology from Indiana University and an MA in anthropology from Syracuse University. He is currently a lecturer in the Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, and also a senior fellow at the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, and a Fox Family Pavilion Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania. He did ethnographic research on the topic of trucking, and he is presenting that research as part of his book, which is recently published, the book entitled The Big Rig, Trucking and the Decline of the American Dream. Please join me in welcoming Steve Viscelli.
Thank you, Martine. So it's really a pleasure to be here. In fact, as I got here last night and was walking to the hotel, I realized it's actually an honor to be here as an ethnographer, as someone who has been so influenced by the ethnography that has been done at Berkeley, to have this actually be the first talk on my book here, and to be invited to the Center for Ethnographic Research is really quite an honor. So thank you, Martine, for the invitation. So I'm going to be talking about my book today, and there are really two main questions that the book attempts to answer, which is, how did trucking jobs become so bad? And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how bad they became and how good they were before. But that's part of the larger historical story that's in the book that I don't quite have time to cover all of it, so I'm going to abbreviate it at the beginning, and we can come back to it certainly toward the end. I'm going to focus more on the second set of questions, which is more of the contemporary look at the labor market in trucking and how it works, and how truckers are convinced to take what ends up being the much worse option for them in terms of employment, which is independent contracting. So the question ends up being, what are the employers doing to convince workers that this arrangement is in their interest? So the overall argument of the book focuses on the deregulation of the industry and the transformation of class relations. I know there's a lot of text here. But the argument of the book is essentially that under regulation, so the trucking industry was regulated until 1980, and under that regulation, there was a cooperation, a labor capital accord, if you will, between firms and regulated trucking that actually made trucking more profitable than it would have been otherwise. Deregulation changed all that, ended up destroying worker power, in most notably the Teamsters Union's control over those labor markets, and caused significant problems for the industry. And that happened pretty rapidly, within a few years. And so this is part of what we would think of as this neoliberal agenda of deregulation, right? And my interest was really in, we know a lot about kind of the policy prescriptions and the ideas and the legislation at a sort of very high level of what neoliberalism is. And we know a lot of consequences that are coming out of these policy prescriptions. But we don't know a lot about what's happening in between. And in particular, I wanted to know, where do workers encounter these ideas? How do these ideas affect their behavior, the way that they see their opportunities in the market, et cetera? And what I found actually was that neoliberalism had this policy prescription of deregulating, and that was really a negative sort of project. It was about destroying worker power, right? It was about removing the state's influence over class relations. But it really didn't have a prescription for how capital was going to be accumulated afterwards. Didn't have a set of policy prescriptions for how companies could make great profit afterwards. And in fact, deregulation actually hurt profitability in the industry, and it was up to employers then, together, collectively, to create a new set of employment relations and class relations in the industry. And that's the larger story told by the book. And we can come back to that. Okay, so why trucking? Right? So it's this very early and successful case of deregulation, right at the top of the deregulatory agenda in the 1970s. Deregulation created this cheap, fast set of trucking services. It's hard to overstate the importance of trucking deregulation. Without trucking deregulation, globalization as we think about it today, right, does not happen the way that it does. You don't get the return on long global supply chains unless you can move stuff nationally very cheaply. Right? Again, we can talk more about those sorts of issues. What also interested me about it was this case not only where you had sort of rapid changes in the work and what people were doing, but you had historically arguably the most powerful labor union in American history, the Teamsters Union, and they were completely wiped out in this segment of the economy, right? Which has been virtually de-unionized. You don't see any long-haul truck drivers anymore who are union members any longer. And today it exemplifies this new set of labor market conditions, right? Sped up and degraded jobs. We've seen wages decline by about half for these long-haul truck drivers. Employers are able to successfully shift the cost of inefficiencies onto labor, and we see extensive non-standard employment relations, most notably independent contracting. So this is what interests me about it, and I figured with all this stuff going on over the last few decades, truckers probably noticed and had something to say about it. And I was really interested in, to use the old-fashioned terms, of the class consciousness of these workers, right? I wanted to know how more experienced workers understood the industry and what had happened to it, as well as how their understandings of the industry might differ from new workers coming into the industry. So that's what I set out to understand. Just going to sort of briefly go over the sort of bigger project and what it was. So 6 months I spent training and then working as a long-haul truck driver at the start of the research. I then did about 100 interviews with truckers in different arrangements from the one that I experienced, as well as then interviews with managers and owners and others in the industry, staff, that people who dispatch the workers, etc. I kind of lost count. I've been doing, I just continued to do interviews forever. I don't know if anybody else has this problem, but you find someone that's like, well, you might have a new perspective, and you just do another interview and another interview. Okay, so there I also then did a lot of observations throughout of truck stops and companies, but also some collective action that workers tried to engage in, particularly around the Great Recession and some of the spiking fuel prices that had happened. I did some statistical work to get at some of these historical changes, as well as looking at lots of different primary and secondary documents. In addition to that, the original ethnographic fieldwork ended up leading me into some policy work, and that's become a source of some really interesting insights. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the very end of the talk. Okay. So what I'm going to focus on today is kind of what this looks like from the perspective of workers in this really terrible labor market, why they make the decisions that they do. So first, it's important to realize that, and this is critical to the maintenance of these relationships, or these class relations in the industries. There's incredible turnover. So the typical company among these large firms will have over 100% turnover in a given year, sometimes upwards of 120%, meaning that they're training, on average, more than one worker for every position in the company each year. Right now, of course, there are a few workers who are staying longer, but what you find on average is that the typical new worker to the industry won't stay more than 6 months. Okay, so they're constantly recruiting, they're reaching out and making contact with several million workers. They get approximately 300,000 to 400,000 in any given year to sort of come to the door at least and start some initial training, and then they end up hiring somewhere between 150 and 200,000 workers every year. Now this is to fill overall in this one largest segment of the industry, this long haul truckload driving, which means that you're taking a full truckload of goods. These aren't UPS drivers or something along those lines. You're hiring between 150 and 200,000 workers to fill 600,000 slots. Okay. All right. Now, how is that done? It's done in these carrier-controlled training facilities often. Sometimes it's done in private facilities who are associated with them, and sometimes it's done in community colleges. You may have seen these programs advertised, right? And this is called a CDL school, or Commercial Driver's License School. So I responded to an ad, basically went through the interview process, which consisted primarily of a phone tree. At the end of the phone tree, it said, "Congratulations, you've met our minimum qualifications." You then fill out a paper application or an online application, and then a recruiter calls you and says, "Hey, we got a spot in a trucking school. Would you like to come out and become a truck driver?" And so you show up at CDL school. The more experienced drivers call these CDL mills because of the way that they turn out inexperienced workers. And they train you for anywhere from 10 to 12 days in basic operation of the truck. So what this looks like is kind of a half-school environment married up with a big parking lot. In that parking lot are these big tractors, right? These 25,000-pound or so vehicles that are quite difficult to learn to drive at first. And you kind of bang around in them during the morning, and then you come in the afternoon and you might do some classroom work about the regulations that govern the hours you work, or how to deal with customers, things like that. And over this 2-week period, most workers feel like it's job training and they come expecting a kind of job training, but actually what it is you're paying them. So this CDL school, at the very beginning of it, and I'm not entirely clear how many workers realize when they come in the amount of debt that they're going to be taking on for it. But in my case, it was about $3,500. And as soon as I showed up, they make you sign this contract saying that if you don't get hired by the company, you owe the company $3,500 at 24.9% interest. Yeah. Now the great news is, if the company hires you and you work for them for a full year, they'll forgive that debt. Okay. And I'll talk more about that debt peonage as we move on. I have it there. So last on the list. Now my training was actually quite cheap. I interviewed truckers who spent sometimes $6,000, $7,000, even $8,000 on the initial training period. Now, what I then came to learn was that to understand by interviewing trainers was that this isn't actually job training. You learn some stuff, but what it is as one trainer called it, it's an 11-day job interview. So what they're doing is they're kind of testing you under this fatigue. You work, or you train sometimes for 12 hours a day. They put you up in a motel. You're hundreds of miles from home, and they observe you as you see how you follow directions, see how well you're doing at driving the truck. And what the trainers explained to me is they're not there to really teach you how to drive a truck. You can't do that in 10 or 12 days. They're there to see whether you could learn to drive a truck and whether you're worth the investment of the company taking you on and hiring you and then doing this over-the-road training, which is the next step. And before I move on, and again, we can talk about this toward the end, these are costs that the industry has for training workers, right, that get externalized. And in some sense, it goes directly onto the worker in the form of credit, maybe their credit being ruined or something like that. And this debt, you get the debt collectors after them, et cetera. But taxpayers are paying for a good chunk of this, right? So a lot of GIs who come home, right, using GI funds, using up, as one person pointed out, their one kind of chance for these retraining funds that they may get on this school, as well as Workforce Investment Act funds that go for worker retraining. So that's how you enter the industry. Now, I should say that virtually nobody who comes in has any experience or knowledge at all. And I just want to read sort of my description of kind of what this group of people look like who kind of come into this situation. This is the class of trainees that I observed. There was Matt, a white evangelical in his late 20s from St. Louis who had a 4-year degree in philosophy and had been working for several years as a drug and alcohol counselor. Denise, a black woman in her late 30s from a poor neighborhood in Kansas City. As a single mom, she'd worked a steady string of low-paying retail jobs to support her kids who all still lived at home. Now her oldest was expecting a child of her own, and Denise needed a job to add more income to her house. There was Dennis, a white 24-year-old who'd served in the Army in Afghanistan as a helicopter mechanic. Mitch was a white male from Ohio in his late 50s who'd worked for 30 years at Chrysler. Rick was a white truck mechanic looking at 40 from a small town off the interstate somewhere in Indiana. Jackie and Laura were a gay couple from northeast Indiana who planned to drive as a team. Jackie had been doing temp work, and Laura had been working in food service. Brian and Beth were newlywed evangelical Christians who'd just completed 4-year degrees in psychology. They hoped to live frugally and save up enough money for graduate school. I would not advise this as a strategy for saving up money for graduate school. Joe, a single white male, had served as a computer specialist in Afghanistan, then operated forklifts for Kraft. Tyler was a white man in his 40s, left his job as a plumber when his benefits went to shit. Bob was a non-union factory worker looking for better pay and job security. John and Mike had both worked at Home Depot. Bill was a 20-something who'd worked on a highway maintenance crew. Okay, and just on and on. So it's incredibly diverse backgrounds, work experiences that folks come into this training with, none of which has to do with trucking, right? And in most cases, relatively little experience ever operating heavy equipment, which obviously can provide some good paying job opportunities, etc. So what happens, you get through this CDL school, and then if the company decides to hire you, they put you in what's often called a finishing program. And this is where you learn how to do the really important work, like picking up freight and what that actually looks like in a real environment, moving it across long distances and delivering it. And I'll talk more about what the work itself looks like. But that's several weeks. In my case, it was I think roughly 2.5 to 3 weeks. Most people, it can take up to 4 to 6 weeks to do this finishing program. And that's when this experienced trainer that you're basically working side by side with says, okay, you're ready to go out on your own. In total, you're looking at basically 2 months, the last bit of which of training, the last bit of which you might get paid a fixed amount, roughly $300 a week in most cases, something like that, while you're doing this work. So this is not something you can do on the side to get ready to do this job. You have to give up whatever job you have, forego whatever income you would have had from it, right, in order to do this stuff. Okay, so most of these workers, again, even when they are successful, they end up working under this sort of in this sort of debt peonage arrangement with the company. Okay, so truckers end up doing what Michael Buravoy says we should expect them to do. They end up playing a game while they're working, where they take the rules and the conditions that are set out and controlled by the employers and others, and they try to figure out where to invest their time and effort in order to get their greatest return with the least amount of stress. So what does this work look like? Essentially, drivers are only paid for the miles that they drive. Okay, so there's tons of other work. I estimated in my case about 30% of the work that I did was completely unpaid. Okay, you're paid only for the miles that you drive. Your time working is governed by federal regulations that set what are called hours of service. Okay, customer behavior, they give you the appointments and tell you where to go, and they can often delay you for huge amounts of time. And you have a very unpredictable work environment that sort of mixes in with all of those things, right? So you could have weather and traffic and breakdowns and things like that. Now, most importantly, and this is one of the big changes from regulation, is that the most efficient way and the most profitable way for companies to find work for you to do is to say, okay, this truck is here in Berkeley and I've got a good paying load in Oakland. That's the closest load to this driver, and it's going, well, you don't really care where it's going most of the time until the driver has to get back home. So you say, all right, go pick up this load in Oakland. It's going to Arlington, Texas. And then in Arlington, Texas, you're going to find the nearest load to that drop-off location, and that might go to Wisconsin. So for me, what my work rotations look like was I might start out in Syracuse, New York, might pick up a load of beer. I would drive that load of beer from Anheuser-Busch facility up to a distribution center in Michigan. In Michigan, I might pick up steel coils and I'd drive them up to Green Bay. And then in Green Bay, I might pick up rolls of paper and drive it down to Mobile, Alabama. In Mobile, I might pick up pillows going to a Target and drive them to South Carolina, and on and on and on like this. And again, I'm dealing with all of the sort of parameters, right, set out by others in terms of the timing and scheduling. And then I'm going to try to figure out within this amount of work or this work assigned to me how to make the most money, right? And so drivers play this game where the goal is to maximize the miles driven on per day, right? Because that's a great goal, right? Because it's tangible, it's directly related to your pay, right? So you focus on this, you develop what I call miles fetish. Everything is about how many miles you drove, and you develop a set of strategies that you use to maximize these miles. So you do some simple things like you plan your work around the unavoidable constraints. So I might have a bunch of paperwork and stuff that maybe is supposed to be done before I pick up or before I go to the customer location, but I know I'm going to be sitting at the customer location for 40 minutes or an hour waiting for them to get me in a dock. So I'm going to wait on that work. Now, of course, new drivers don't know that, and they follow the rules and they do what they're supposed to do, right? And then they get to the customer location 45 minutes later and then wait an hour, right? So you can you speed yourself up using these strategies, right? You do all kinds of finagling of the hours of service regulations because they basically say you can work 60 hours over 7 days. Most drivers typically work 80 to 90 over 7 days. Okay. Mental and physical self-disciplining. So this becomes fatigue management's absolutely critical to balance safety and productivity. Can't fall asleep at the wheel. You also can't take pee breaks every hour and a half or 2 hours, right? So you cut out that coffee, for instance, and you save that for when you need it later in the day. You need that stimulant. You also don't have to stop and use the bathroom as often. So you got to be able to get to that 4 or 5 hour stretch without stopping. Of course, you work yourself to exhaustion, and then lots of this bleeds into your home life. You come home after, in my case, 12 to 19 days on the road at a time. You're exhausted. The first thing you do is you ignore everybody in your life, and you sleep for 12 hours straight, right? You get up, and then you start packing and shopping to sort of get ready for your next trip out on the road, which will most likely come within 36 or 48 hours of you arriving home. Sound like fun? Okay. So there's some outcomes to this game. It shapes the way that workers think about the job and begins to, and also shapes the way that they think about labor market opportunities, right? So they're confident, right, in their ability to schedule labor activity. They get good at the game. They start to become very dissatisfied with their income relative to the hours worked. Now, pretty importantly, they start to understand efficiency as this kind of time, relationship tied to distance, right? So they're really trying to cut down the wasted out-of-route miles, but they also understand fuel efficiency. And this is most often because companies give them a bonus for not idling, etc. So these are kind of the ways that they think about moving freight efficiently and sort of success in the business. But they view everything outside of driving miles as an obstacle. So dealing with customers, unloading freight, paperwork, all of these things are things that keep you from doing what's going to make you money. And of course, this is going to affect how they see other job opportunities, right? Which might involve, say, good customer service or hand unloading fragile freight or things like that. So these jobs look unattractive to them because of this, the way that they look at what is a good job. Okay. So drivers want more paid work. Basically, the outcome is they want more paid work relative to unpaid work. And this is what makes them receptive to what I found is this company discourse around contract. Okay, so now from the company side, briefly, and again, we can talk more about how this fits into their business models and concepts of hiring out, subcontracting, and that later. Why do companies want these new contractors? And actually, I should say, before I move on, there were contractors before deregulation, but they looked very, very different from those today. Most importantly, they got to actually choose the work that they did rather than it simply being assigned to them. So these contractors today work just like employees. And in fact, when I got done with my initial field work, at first I didn't understand what independent contractors were, and I certainly didn't expect to be working alongside them. But then toward the end of my own driving, I realized that there were people working for the exact same company doing the exact same work that I was doing, but they considered themselves self-employed. And so you can imagine at that point as an ethnographer, I'm kind of like, what is going on here? You're self-employed? I thought you were doing exactly what I was doing, right? How do you see it this way? So these are very different than what contractors used to look like long ago, and of course they're romanticized in many of these movies, Convoy and Smokey and the Bandit and that sort of thing, right? But contractors then really did have control over a couple of really important things. They selected the loads that they wanted to haul, and they got to price those loads. Okay, and this is obviously critical. It's part of this larger story of how companies came to redefine this contractor model as one in which you accept whatever's offered to you at the standard pay rate. Okay, that's how you run a good small business according to this discourse that I'm going to talk about in a bit. Okay, so why do companies want these drivers? They want them because they take on the risk of these tractor costs and the operational costs of fuel in particular. There's other stuff they pay for, insurance, taxes, and fees for licenses, etc. This actually increases the retention and the amount people work and your ability to control them. So in this odd twist, these folks who are supposed to be independent contractors and self-employed and choosing their own work actually end up becoming much better employees on the kind of important measures that we would use to think about employee discipline, right? So they're more likely to show up at work and do what you tell them, and that's because of financial vulnerability, which I'll talk about later. You get great tax benefits from this, and most importantly, you don't have payroll taxes, but you also may not be responsible, depending on the state, for workers' compensation payments or unemployment insurance. And nominally, independent contractors, now this has not been tested and it's sort of a complicated question, but they're certainly less likely to unionize, we think, and it may be actually illegal for them to unionize. Okay, so what these companies end up getting is much more experienced labor, much more valuable labor, cheaper, right, and to retain them longer. Now, after a year or two of being an employee, opportunities start to open up in much better kinds of trucking jobs. And most people are surprised to learn this, but Walmart, for instance, is one of the best employers of truck drivers. And there's a long history in why this is and their particular labor management scheme. But Walmart starts their employee drivers at around $80,000 a year, whereas the drivers that are now going to be thinking about being a contractor earn $40,000 or so. And so these better jobs start to open up, and these worse employers who use drivers over the road driving long haul need to figure out how to keep them before they move out of the segment. Okay, and contracting serves that purpose as well. So where do you get somebody, right, who is gonna take this really bad? I mean, obviously, this stuff's all in the company's interest. There are virtually no benefits that I found. There are no benefits that I found, only disadvantages for workers. How do you get workers to voluntarily choose this, right? And so this was sort of stage 2 puzzle for me when I realized what the consequences were after doing the interviews with the workers and talking to more experienced workers who told me essentially, it was terrible. I lost my shirt. It's a scam, and I'll give you some of their words in a minute. But so at the end of the interview phase, I'm kind of looking around going, what, why are they doing this, right? And so where you find these workers, you create them. Okay, and this is really what came out of the ethnographic study of the labor market and this contemporary picture was the set of relationships that produce the decision that workers make, right, to become an independent contractor. And how do you do that? And it's not as easy as you might think. And it took firms over a decade to really kind of refine how they did this. Okay, so just briefly, and I can talk more about the consequences, but they're really dramatic for some of these workers. So this is Claudio. I write about him in the book, and I happened to meet Claudio the day that he had decided this is it, this is enough. He had just gotten his paycheck, and it wasn't the second in a row, but a few weeks before he had a paycheck where he had worked for 5 days. And after the company made all its deductions for his payment for the truck and fuel and all that stuff, he ended up owing the company $100. And he had worked for 5 days. And the company said, well, it's because you only worked 5 days rather than 7. You're not going out for long enough. We need to send you out. So he went out for 7 days, a couple times in a row. At one point, he tried to work for like a month and a half. He had small kids without going home, and his family just couldn't take it. So when I met him, he had just worked a couple 7-day weeks. And got a paycheck for the last of those 7-day weeks, the most recent one, and he got $41.58. And he just, that's it. He couldn't take it anymore, and crossed paths with me in this truck stop where I'm doing interviews. We sat down at a booth, and this is what he said: "I'm going to quit. I got $41.58 in pay for a 7-day work week. It's not going to put food on my family's table. It's not going to pay for my home. And every time I call them up to talk about it, they're too busy to talk." So he was kind of in this end stage where they start to get really coercive with workers, and I'll talk more about that. But essentially, what's most likely going to happen to Claudio is when he threatens to quit, the company's going to say, "Okay, you could quit, but remember when you leased that truck from us or from our sister shell company? You actually signed that contract, and what the contract says is that if you break your employment contract with us, you have to turn the truck back in, and you're responsible for every payment that would have been made on it. So you're going to owe us $65,000. Or you could keep working. Your choice." And so he realizes that this is what's going to happen. He can't afford a lawyer. He can't afford to wait. Even if he could afford a lawyer, he can't afford to wait for the legal process to sort of bring him justice if it does. Okay, so we have these kinds of experiences, right, of Claudio, and again, this is really dramatic stuff. And when I talk to more experienced workers, right, they all knew this. So if I talk to drivers with 10, 15, 20 years of driving experience, they would say something like this: contracting 70, 90% a scam. If this company is going to be making all this money with a truck, why would they want to give you a truck, right? If they're out here saying this truck's netting me $20,000, I'm going to put a driver in this truck, and I'm going to operate it if it was profitable to own a truck, right? So these more experienced drivers, and of course, they have a very different understanding of the industry. It's very structural. It's very much about the economics of employment and asset ownership. And they say there's no gain, there's no profit in owning a truck. And economists will tell you the exact same thing. It's not a highly specified asset, right? It doesn't have any return because it's not scarce, right? So there's nothing to be gained by owning a truck. There's only risk. And the experienced drivers know that. And yet I would still meet drivers like Joe, right? So, and literally sometimes one after the other. And I want to flag the driver I just interviewed down and say, "Hey, wait, can you tell this guy what you just told me?" So this is Joe. He was a 36-year-old black male, just entered the industry 9 months before. Remarkable guy in that he was going full out toward contracting. He said, "Yeah, I'm on a mission. I believe in 5 years you could be taking money and investing it." Right, pays off his truck, investing it 7 to 10 years after that. You could be a millionaire. All right, if you stay focused, stay disciplined. Joe was working, I estimated, around 100 hours a week. He had started working 9 months earlier. He had not taken a day off since. He lived in Dallas, Fort Worth, and had not returned there since the day he was hired. He had just been driving freight around the country, the entire United States, for 9 months straight. And he was doing a lot of homework and a lot of research about what contracting was all about. And I'm gonna come back to Joe in a minute to sort of show you what this decision-making process looks like. And Joe actually is a great example of, he is not, he's doing his homework, right? He's not looking for a get-rich-quick scheme. He's not He's willing to invest his time and money long term into an opportunity like self-employment, right? And he's talking to everybody he can meet, right? And I'll get back to that in a minute. But what Joe's going to encounter, and what he is encountering when I meet him, is what I call the contracting discourse. Okay, and so this contracting discourse essentially says to workers, look, this this opportunity that you see of independent contracting, it's kind of the next stage. It's like the further development of your career as a truck driver. You were an employee, now you're going to be self-employed as an independent contractor. The key to this is working hard and efficiently. You already know how to do that because you see it in your paycheck every week. You know how to maximize your productivity. That's going to be critical, and keeping your fuel costs low. Contractors make a lot more money than employee drivers. Now that's not true, and I'll talk about that. But they figure out ways to sort of do it that are actually pretty easy to pull off, because when you look at the gross revenue that folks make doing this, it's quite large. And the truckers who have just been driving loads don't understand the full costs that go into maintaining, operating the truck, the licenses, the inspection, the tags. And oftentimes when I would ask truckers what they thought, who were considering buying their own truck, what they thought to operate it, they would often be off by tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes $10,000, $20,000. They would underestimate their likely costs. Okay, now they have no access to this information. How would they've never been exposed to the balance sheet of these companies. They don't know what these extra fees, et cetera, cost. Okay. But there's a lot of stuff that's about kind of class relations, right? And I got really excited when I sort of saw this stuff. Like, they're explicitly kind of telling people what, who I am relative to you, and how our interests align or don't align, et cetera. And I'll show you some more of that. But basically, the contracting relationship is portrayed as a business partnership, right? A mutually beneficial business partnership. And of course, at the sort of bottom of it, and this gets back to that game that truckers play, what do they want? They want control over the work that they do. They want to be able to choose it, and that is central to what contracting promises. And in fact, as I'll come back to at the end, that's a legal requirement. So in order for you to be treated as an independent contractor in the United States, you have to have control over not only what work you do, but how you do it. And contracting, so companies contract that, suggest to workers that they're going to have that. Uh-oh. Guess I hit mute. Okay. So what does that look like? Here's a typical ad, right? And I would point out, so again, the game basically is about running the most miles you can, right, times your pay rate. So the typical driver I made 26 cents a mile. The typical driver today might start out at 28 or 30. Average driver might make 36 cents a mile. So when they see pay rates like this of $1.25 per mile, literally I had drivers say to me, I don't know what owner-operators do with all this money. They don't understand. They don't have a clear picture of what those costs are that are going to chip away at that. But it has the sort of key metrics, right? So here's the average length of trip. Now, typically for me, an average length of haul, they call it, would be, my average length of haul was somewhere under 500 miles. So 2,000 miles is kind of, and then it's sort of coast to coast, right? Coast to coast means very little unpaid work, right? So when you're frustrated, you've been out on the road for a couple years now, pay actually increases quite quickly for the first couple years, and then it kind of levels off. And drivers don't get any return to experience. They start to get really frustrated with the job opportunities they see immediately around them. And what are they looking for? They're looking for more miles, right, at a higher rate. And companies promises that's going to happen. Now of course, the advantage there too is you get to work for mega trucks, right? You get to tell your kids you work for mega trucks. Right? All right, so, you say, well, this just looks like an infomercial, right? Who's going to fall for this, right? But it's actually, some of these advertisements and the discourse itself is way more sophisticated than an outsider would initially pick up on, right? So already you have sort of what is a resonant sort of picture of what the life of contracting and the importance of contracting is going to be for you, right? Higher pay rate, more miles, right? You know that those are the key ingredients to making more money, right? But it gets way more sophisticated than that. So this is a 2-page ad from one of the leading companies, and it has all of the elements of this discourse about being your own boss, etc. And then it has this weird sort of thing over here, which is you can afford it, but we'll get to that. So be your own boss. We have everything you need, sort of great loads, options that'll fit your needs, etc. Now this truck up here, right? It's a beautiful truck, right? And we'll get to it. That's a very expensive truck. So initially, when you look at this, it's not going to seem within reach to you, and I'm going to explain how that is. And then you kind of you look to this side, and this is the side that's actually for the drivers that in their current situation. This side over here is what you dream about being in long term in the future, which is owning and operating your own trucking business. But right now, you're going to buy or lease a new truck. So let's break this down so I can show you how sophisticated this is. All right, beautiful truck. This is the classic. And so when you're driving a truck, you quickly learn to recognize the differences among them. This truck is going to immediately be recognized as an owner-operator truck. Now, why is that? Because it has all of these fancy extras on it, like chrome flat bumpers and a diamond plate toolbox and these stacks that come up. And these things are all expensive extras that no company would pay for on their standard truck. So this, that this truck is owned by a trucker who has not only the right, but the spare capital, right, to invest in these extras. Now, beyond that, it's actually a very inefficient truck. It has this very square front hood or front nose, this flat bumper, these things that stick up. These are all going to cost you thousands of dollars. That right there is going to cost you several $1,000s a year more in operational costs just for the extra fuel it's going to burn. Now, this truck is a niche truck. You would use this truck it's got a more powerful engine most likely. You're going to use it to haul heavy equipment, something like that. You're very seldom going to see one of these trucks hauling a standard box trailer, which is what most of these new drivers are doing. You're going to see it driven by somebody who's pulling a flatbed, not going great distances, doesn't really care too much about his fuel economy, etc. Okay, so you actually look at that truck and you think, now this is the premier brand. This truck's going to cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of $150,000, right? Okay. Now you know that you can't afford that, and it's also probably got a more complex transmission, more gears, etc. And you know it's not a good decision for you. So on the other side, you have the large inventory that they offer of money-making trucks, including Freightliners and International. So that other one was a Peterbilt that they kind of highlighted over there. They don't even offer to sell those, right? So they're kind of peddling the junk that they're selling next to the premier brand. Right? And why would you do that, right? Because this actually resonates even more deeply with the understandings that workers have. What's going to make you successful, right? Low truck payments, low fuel costs, right? An efficient truck is what you need, right? To, as it says down here somewhere, high miles per gallon translates into more profit for you, right? Buy or lease a truck and become an independent owner-operator. Now you put them together, right? And what it says is, yeah, you know you're not ready for that. You're not going to go out and be an independent. You don't know how to find customers. You don't know how to price loads. You're not going to be hauling anything that's going to justify owning that truck. You're probably not going to make that much money either. But you can do this. In fact, that's the truck that I drove, actually, right there. You're going to be driving the exact same truck. It seems like a big step going into business for yourself, self-employment. But, you're going to be driving the same truck, same transmission. You can do this, right? So you buy or lease, you can afford it, right? And so what this is, right, is a career path laid out, right? The aspiration really for most drivers is this, right? At least in the abstract, they have they have very little sense. Most have no idea how they would actually go about being an independent, and they're afraid of doing it because it involves lots of experience and knowledge and risk. But it says, this is the next step, right? So contracting is this next step. All right, so you might get this from your company, right? These are all company promotions, right? Say, oh, mega trucks, you'll make tons of money, right? Now, oftentimes this is your same employer doing it, right? And then you might, at some point, all the workers I talked to said, yeah, but it seems too good to be true. And it's like, if my employer wants me to buy the truck, says I'm going to make more money, it doesn't work, right? Something's a little fishy, right? So I better Google this. So let's hear from Joe. Okay, so Joe, who thinks he can be a millionaire in 7 to 10 years, he says, I'm getting a lot of feedback as far as what contractors earn and take-home pay. I heard people who make this much and some people don't make that much. Some people say, that's crazy. There's no way you can make that kind of money. And I'm thinking, if these guys have been out here for this long, they must know what they're talking about. So then why is this other person telling me that they're making so much money? And so he goes on, and he says, so I pretty much believe that you can, and not just one person. I said, well, maybe this is just one person that got lucky, like winning the lottery. Well, let me make sure this isn't a lucky thing that happened to this one guy, because I know it's not easy. From what I've heard, it's not easy, right? So Joe has heard these disconfirming stories, right? He's heard the horror stories of Claudio. He's heard the more experienced drivers saying, "Oh, don't do it, don't do it." So what's Joe going to do today? Now, at the time that I started the interviews, he wouldn't have Googled it. The internet is having an effect. We can talk about it. But today, they'd Google it, right? You'd say, what do owner-operators make? Is this a good deal? Is this just a scam, right? And so, in fact, I made this slide this morning. I Googled it this morning. Okay, owner-operator income. I think I Googled, and I clicked on images, and this was the first representation of what owner-operators versus company drivers or employees make. So what you have here is mean U.S. income adjusted for inflation, which comes from the Census Bureau. Then the second line here is the inflation-adjusted owner-operator income. All right, and we can talk about the sort of sources here. These are averages of ATBS clients. We'll talk about them later. And then down here you have company drivers. And, well, it's pretty authoritative to me, right? So drivers do go out and they do a bunch of research, but what they encounter is actually this interconnected web of third parties, labor market intermediaries, some of them, right, who are actually presenting lots of very sophisticated disinformation. And this is just one example of them. Now, this is complete bunk. Owner-operators, independent contractors make less. Sorry, there's someone interpreting back there, and I don't know. Bunk didn't translate. Okay. So, but this is coming to you from Overdrive, right? The #1 business publication for owner-operators. Seems like the right place to go, right? And you can qualify for your free subscription. Now, Overdrive, it turns out, is a long and storied publication in the trucking industry. It's been around since the 70s. Used to be a muckraking journal for truck drivers. And we'll talk about later about what it is today. Or you might go to these other third parties that promote this contracting discourse, like business consultants, like ATBS, and it was their income figures that you saw on that middle light blue line. And so ATBS describes itself, if you were to go to their website, or one of the many trucking business or truck shows that they go and present at, they present themselves as having been developed with owner-operators in mind to help them be more successful, to take on the accounting and provide business services to allow them to do what they do best, which is drive the truck. And they claim that their clients make 40% more in profit and save thousands in taxes. Again, all incorrect. Okay, so this is kind of the third puzzle for me. I'm kind of taking you chronologically through in some ways. The third puzzle was, I know that you have these third-party labor market intermediaries, right? We see them in the literature. They talk about how they introduce people to new opportunities. Maybe it's temp agencies explaining to workers why it might be good for them to work in the temp world, things like this. We know that there are these kind of third parties that get involved when there are information problems, matching workers to jobs, etc. But I started to get suspicious because as I was coding these things, I kept turning up the same companies over and over and over again. And at one point in particular, which is some of this data here, drivers are paid by the mile. Okay, and it's been that way since deregulation. That's how contractors were paid up until the Great Recession. And then all of a sudden, all these articles started to appear about how it was better to get paid as a percentage of the load, right? And I said, I've been driving for 35 years, and I always run on percentage. You can make more money by running fewer miles, right? So all these articles started appearing in trucking publications, etc. And I just, as I'm coding them, I'm putting in the company names, and I realized Landstar, American Trucking Business Services, Quality Research, Overdrive, Snyder, and these companies just kept coming up and over and over and over. And I said, there's either a reporter's beat, right? This reporter has contacts at these companies, or this is barking, right? Which is what you do at a carnival game right? So sort of, step right up, right? Everyone's a winner, right? Bargains galore. So I put these companies into Google in a string. Yeah, 5. Okay. And what ended up happening was I find this, which is the sales pitch for ATBS to its strategic partners. And its strategic partners are all those people who are getting quoted and whose data is getting used and whose job opportunities are getting promoted, etc. Right? And the ATBS president then explained this. He said carriers went to percentage pay because freight that's weak has weak margins, and as the economy was tanking, they wanted to have drivers make less by paying them a percentage. But what was really important to me was that he said at least 5 significant carriers have asked us who does it and how it works. So what this company essentially does is it collectively manages labor for all of these companies. It benchmarks their wages so that they can know what each other. Now this is a theoretical impossibility for economists, right? That these companies are all collaborating, sharing their internal labor strategies, data, etc. Right? But they're doing it. This is class action, right? Which is not supposed to be happening as much. Okay. So then they have newsletters where they advise people as to how they should work, right? And they do so as an independent business consultant. Now, when you go to leave your job, they come in and do the math for you to convince you that it's not in your interest to do that. They offer triage. That's when you're going to quit. And Overdrive. It now has a 2-pronged editorial focus of assisting. This is in their private sort of media stuff that they send to their advertisers. Assisting drivers as they transition to running an owner-operator business is now one of their goals. Help company drivers prepare to be a truck and business owners. And so their tagline used to be the voice of the American trucker. For their advertisers, it's delivering the owner-operator. Right? And they deliver them to what would have otherwise been employers. So my conclusions, the existing theories, right? In existing theories, class action is increasingly rare, even absent in labor markets in the new economy, right? Because of and we were mainly focused on the decline of formal labor market institutions like unions. But we can't really understand why these deregulated markets are so bad for workers unless we understand that there is a whole lot of class action happening, but it's affecting these informal labor market institutions, right? So these include training, recruitment, benchmarking, information sources, et cetera, that workers have. Right? And this is coordinated class action on the part of employers. So I do have just one more slide, CD.